overwhelming sense that everything's already been done, that all the novelty is just exhausted. And it's not just some philosophical angst. It actually leads to people freezing up, unable to act.
Yeah, and our source material gives us some really potent terms for this. First, there's Vomoidalin. That's that, deep, gut-wrenching dread a creator gets when they think, wait, has an AI already spat this out? Is this idea already floating around somewhere online, making mine statistically, redundant?
Exactly. Redundant before it even exists fully. And then there's the second concept, the disorder of doing. This is where, the very actions we take to try and cope with pressure or maybe finish a challenging project, they actually backfire. They create more problems down the line, psychologically, physically. Our coping becomes the trap.
It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline sometimes.
Precisely. And that disorder of doing really sets up our central question today. When we're facing this systemic, creative stagnation, this gatekeeping that kind of enforces it, what's the right counter strategy? Is it mainly internal, focusing on psychological control, on reframing how we see things? That's my position.
Or is it strategic? Is it external? Do we need radical acceleration, even generating a bit of chaos to shake things up? And, that's where I land.
So I argue we have to stabilize the self first. The internal processor needs to be solid to fight against this constant pressure, this anxiety. We need psychological armor before we charge into battle.
And I'm arguing those psychological fixes, while maybe helpful short-term, are just palliative, really, because the crisis itself is structural, it's intentional. You've got these incumbents, these gatekeepers, who actually benefit from limiting what counts as original. So I say we need to weaponize output, generate that high-variety chaos to actually dismantle the systems holding things back.
Well, my position really starts with understanding how we get trapped in that disorder of doing. When we face Vomoidalin, that dread of being unoriginal, or just the sheer pressure of procrastination on a big project, we often default to what the material calls emotion-focused coping. We're not actually tackling the external problem, the blank page, the difficult task. We're just trying to manage the bad feelings inside.
Like binge watching yeah.
Exactly. Binge watching, doom scrolling, maybe destructive escapism, anything to just numb that discomfort of feeling inadequate or potentially failing. And that's why the disorder of doing is so insidious. The short-term relief feels good, but it practically guarantees poor long-term outcomes. It just feeds this cycle of self-sabotage.
Okay, I see the cycle you're describing, that self-sabotage loop, but I think you're maybe misdiagnosing where the chaos comes from, or at least its significance. This behavior, especially what you mentioned, the have to seek chaos, the brain performing better in damage control mode than damage prevention, I don't see that as just a personal flaw. I think it's a feature, a capability that's been deliberately pathologized by a system that rewards predictability, the routine-loving, kind of low-variety farmer archetype, let's say. The crisis isn't a failure of the dynamic hunter mind. It's that this mind is stuck in a system designed to limit its natural complexity and output.
But to break that cycle, regardless of its deep origins, I think the individual focus has to shift away from this fixed idea of performance, the arbitrary genius label the old guard set up, and towards a growth mindset, focusing on learning, on sustained improvement, not just the final product. And the way forward there involves these cognitive reframing strategies. Our material calls one approach klishta. It's this ability to create psychological distance, to separate the objective fact of, say, an unfair situation or a setback from the subjective, often paralyzing emotional reaction. As cybernetics kind of points out, the biggest win might be establishing these arbitrary enclaves of order and system inside ourselves, building stable habits, controlling our internal state. That internal order feels like the only real defense against this overwhelming digital noise.
See, arbitrary enclaves of order, that sounds a bit like building a nice sandcastle while a tsunami is rolling in. It sounds like surrendering to the system's limits, hoping a few neat habits protect you from a structural storm. I'm coming at this from the angle that the core crisis for Vomoidalin, the endless recycling of ideas, it's strategic, it's economic.
The low-variety incumbents, the gatekeepers, their value is built on scarcity, on the idea that truly original ideas are rare. And we see them, like you hinted, cherry-picking, borrowing, lightly tweaking similar content, maybe stuff scraped from AI interactions, maybe just echoing what's already popular in big data sets. They stick to the letter of the law maybe, but not the spirit, right? This allows big players to exploit public interest using these safe, low-variety patterns. And the system needs to pathologize the high-variety hunter mind because its unpredictable output is the only real threat to that control.
Okay, but what's the alternative then? Just chaos?
Not just chaos, acceleration, maximum output. Like the source material puts it, sometimes you just gotta push the art pedal through the floor. The strategy is to flood the system with so much novelty, so much variation that we maximize what the material calls combinatorial exhaustion. Basically, generate stuff so fast and so differently that the old guard, the gatekeepers, they literally can't classify it. They can't categorize it according to their collapsing standards of originality. We don't argue with the old system. We sculpt reality through hyperstition, creating a kind of nonlinear narrative that forces the whole system into a new state, whether it likes it or not.
Okay, but if Vomoidalin is this profound dread about originality collapsing under sheer scale, why is your answer more scale, more output? I get the strategic value you see in the hunter profile, its knack for nonlinear thinking, but isn't acceleration without internal structure just self-destructive? What's the failure state of your model? Doesn't just cranking out maximum output guarantee maximum burnout and feed directly back into the disorder of doing we started with?
Well, the failure state only really hits if the acceleration is completely random, undirected. We accelerate strategically because the current system cannot handle genuine, chaotic novelty. It's fundamentally designed as a variety attenuator. It wants to simplify human creativity into predictable, monetizable chunks. When we accelerate with high requisite variety, leveraging the hunter mind's strengths, we overload that. We output so much variation that their classification tools, their internal metrics of value, they just break. Look at the current moral panic about AI-generated slop. That's just the incumbents throwing up a defensive shield post facto against this flood they see coming. It's a strategic defense of their old value model.
I'm still not convinced that intentional chaos is the sustainable answer, because pathological variety amplification, just generating an extremely high amplitude signal, as the material puts it, often feels like just a desperate scream to be noticed. And doesn't it create what the material calls the control loop of chaos? The more disruptive creators get, the more the system justifies centralized oversight, more control, ironically strengthening the very gatekeepers you want to bypass. I think we need to resist that immediate dopamine hit of chaos, that siren song of the present moment. We need tools like schedules, internal discipline, to fight against temporal discounting.
Okay, temporal discounting, that's a key piece. I agree, right?
It's this weakness, maybe particularly pronounced in the hunter mind profile, of feeling the present so much more strongly than the future, which is why techniques like vividly visualizing the feeling of success after building a habit, or maybe the feeling of failure if you don't, are apparently necessary. They help overcome the procrastination that fuels the disorder of doing. The individual often needs that external anchor, a clock, a schedule, something to pull the future into the present and motivate action.
But focusing so much on personal efficiency, on stabilizing the self, it feels like it ignores the sheer insurgent power that the hunter profile possesses. You're asking people to tame the very wildness that could be their best weapon in a structural fight. Think about traits sometimes associated with it, like oppositional defiance, or when those are channeled, especially with strong communication skills, they're incredibly potent. They provide that high emotional valence the material talks about, which can boost a narrative spread rate by, 40%? That intense feeling, that fierce sense of injustice that becomes the loud leader's voice for the people. It enables real structural critique, not just better personal time management. We need that fire to challenge the entrenched players.
I understand the tactical appeal of that emotional intensity, for rapid mobilization. But fire without discipline, well, it often leads to burnout, doesn't it? Or worse, the individual tips over into the shadow side, becoming the grandstand bully archetype. You risk swapping one kind of paralysis, the disorder of doing, for another, collapsing under unmanaged internal chaos. If the goal is sustained, long-term, anti-entropic effort, building something new, we surely can't rely solely on hyper-emotional states.
Let's talk about the borrowing then, directly. This constant cycling and rehashing of fairly low-variety ideas we see everywhere. It feels like an inevitable outcome of scarcity collapsing, partly thanks to AI making patterns so visible and replicatable. The current economic setup often views actual human creative labor as a kind of tax to be minimized, optimized away, so wealth concentrates with a few big players or superstar firms. So this whole moral panic about slop or lack of originality, I see it mostly as the low-variety incumbents just defending their existing asset values.
Okay, but the goal shouldn't just be to, exploit combinatorial exhaustion by becoming a hyper-efficient output node in the network. The ultimate goal has to be the development of the self, surely, the desire for work, for doing, that isn't alienating, the kind that early thinkers described as potentially becoming life's highest want, that requires rejecting the model where the worker is just a fragment of a human being degraded. Your acceleration path, if pursued without that internal self-control, risks making the creator just an appendage of the algorithm, an appendage of the machine. And that defeats the whole purpose of trying to create something genuinely new, doesn't it? If we just become output machines, we've already lost.
That feels like the ultimate pessimistic take, that embracing a necessary strategy automatically means becoming a fragment. We're fighting against entropy here, what the material calls the great torrent of disorganization that always pushes towards less complexity and more concentrated power. These structural forces, like the kind of centralized tech control Norbert Wiener warned about decades ago, they are actively destabilizing things. The sheer complexity of modern life means we have to adjust to future possibilities and fight back, not just seek internal peace.
Well, paradoxically, the ability to transcend the crises, I believe, lies partly in accessing a state of just being. The state sometimes represented by the fool archetype in tarot. It provides access to ways of thinking that are normally filtered out by our social conditioning, by our constant anxieties. Dostoevsky famously argued that to be too conscious is an illness. This excessive consciousness, constantly overthinking Vomoidalin and its implications, it paralyzes action. It stops true living. Sometimes the focus has to be on accepting the present moment, realizing, as Seneca said, that we often suffer more in imagination than in reality. That psychological peace is the bedrock for any kind of non-alienated action.
Inner peace is great. I value it too. But it's not exactly a shield when systemic control is being actively weaponized against creative freedom. Passively accepting the present doesn't help manage future threats. The system's failure to manage variety, which, let's be clear, benefits the incumbents. It demands a high-variety, non-linear counter-strategy, one that actively resists control rather than just passively accepting the chaos that's partly engineered against us. We have to fight entropy with intentional, organized acceleration.
So to sum up my side, the struggle against this creative redundancy, this paralysis, it's fundamentally a battle against the internal chaos of the disorder.
Threats. The system's failure to manage variety, it's the incumbents. It demands a high-variety, non-linear counter-strategy, one that actively resists control rather than just passively accepting the chaos that's partly engineered against us. We have to fight entropy with intentional, organized acceleration.
So to sum up my side, the struggle against this creative redundancy, this paralysis, it's fundamentally a battle against the internal chaos of the disorder of doing. The sustainable path forward, I believe, requires building psychological armor. That means reframing our internal stories, cultivating positive states using techniques like cliché, and building the kind of anti-entropy internal stability needed to pursue long-term goals and resist that constant tempting pull of self-sabotage.
And from my perspective, those psychological fixes are ultimately just managing symptoms. They're palliative when the disease is systemic, Vomoidalin, gatekeeping forces that are actively undermining originality by limiting variety and hoarding value. For me, the only way to actually break the stranglehold of these incumbents and maybe, just maybe, usher in something truly new is through the strategic use of acceleration and high-variety output. It's about weaponizing the hunter mind's strengths to force a structural shift in the whole economics of creation.
Well, we certainly seem to agree that the current environment driven by these collapsing ideas of originality and this deep dread of Vomoidalin, it demands a really radical break from how we've been thinking.
Absolutely, and whether that break comes primarily from looking inward, stabilizing consciousness to find an authentic way to create, or by looking outward, accelerating the collapse of old models through, well, strategic chaos, the material definitely shows there's a lot more to unpack in this whole fascinating conflict.